Hello and welcome back. I'm Blinthleyer, ex-McKinsey, ex-Deutsche Bank, ex-Virgin Media, author of The ADHD Boss and Beyond Buy-In. If you're new here, I help nonprofits design and deliver strategies with measurable impact that beneficiaries want, donors will fund, and staff can celebrate. I do this with a series of facilitated workshops to refine what you have, stress test your plan, innovate frugally, and set you up to deliver value and ROI that you can evidence. In my last video, I talked about my mission to decision sprints, the strategy on a page, and the questions that I thought that every organization needs to answer in order to build that strategy. Today, I'm doing a bit of a deep dive into some of these workshops. This is an overview. Obviously, every organization is different, and so I do tend to mix these up, move them around, and to some extent remix what's in them. But this is, let's say, the basics of mission to decision sprint. It is a set of 10 workshops that you can do either in a 2-week period, as in 5 business days, or that you can spread over a longer period of time. I don't advise that people take longer than 4 to 6 weeks to complete this, simply because people forget what happens between workshops. They lose the momentum. They lose some of the psychological safety that they've developed in the room. Some of their best ideas kind of fizzle out if there's not enough engagement in them and they can't build on them. 4 to 6 weeks is usually the maximum period that I suggest that people use to build their strategy, considering that they're going to spend a lot more time on the transformation that needs to follow in order to implement and deliver that strategy. Let's start with the first workshop. So I like to use RADO and definition of done. RADO is the traditional RAID methodology of risks, assumptions, issues, dependencies, plus the O for opportunities, because a lot of the time when people are surfacing their challenges, they're also thinking in the back of their mind of some opportunities or solutions they've thought of. There could be a myriad of reasons why they have not either suggested that to someone before, or they might feel like they've suggested this multiple times and weren't listened to. It doesn't really matter. What's more important is getting their ideas on paper. A lot of what happens in organizations is people have assumptions that they've never tested with anyone. For example, I worked with an education charity where their assumption was we cannot change any of the programs because the board already agreed to them. The board themselves was very interested in them changing the programs, actually, because they felt that the programs were not delivering the impact they wanted to have. And so being able to surface that is super important. I also think that resistance complaints are really useful data that organizations often want to ignore. They want people to be happy and excited about the strategy and change, and are not always open to those who are neither of those things. I personally believe that giving them the opportunity to surface those risks and issues up front is really valuable, because usually people have very logical reasons for why they resist change and why they think a particular strategy isn't a good idea. I believe in getting that on the table and being able to work with them to address that, rather than trying to silence that, suppress it, or underplay it. I think that this also, once you do the RADO correctly, you create a really good shared understanding of your starting position and how good or bad certain elements of it are before you get going, which is very helpful because you can then always refer back to what you uncovered in that session when someone later on has a view that differs from that. The second thing that I want to do in that workshop is definition of done. And this is to prevent teams from either undercooking the strategy or overcooking the strategy. This is, how do you know when you are finished? How do you know when this is ready to hand over to the leadership team, the board, the trustees, whoever needs to actually approve this? And setting that up with the acceptance criteria, as in for the person who's going to approve this, what are the things that they need to see before they will approve this? Those might be elements, for example, a clear mission, a clear mandate, etc. They might be about the way that you're going to deliver this. So how will you deal with accountability? How are you going to prioritize going forward? There might be something about just the mechanics of it. Who's going to do what must be clear. What your metrics are must be clear. It doesn't really matter. What's more important is that you have that information up front so that you don't deliver something that can't be either actioned or approved. The next workshop that I believe in is one on beneficiaries. Beneficiaries are who you exist to serve or to benefit. Most organizations have a clear view of who their beneficiaries are. However, they're often looking at beneficiaries as a big group. For example, if I am a education organization, I may say that I am working with students, right? Students is a very broad term, and it's very difficult to make specific decisions about what you do or don't do on the basis of students as a huge bucket, because someone who is a first-time student at a university at age 18 has very different goals from someone who is 35 in a apprenticeship that requires they do a certain amount of university hours in a particular time period. Those two people are going to have completely different experiences, and you may be the sort of organization that targets them both, in which case you need to develop programs, campaigns, projects that speak to both of them. But you also may have a much narrower definition of beneficiaries than you understand, right? I once worked with a disabled athlete charity, and they were trying to work out who exactly they were doing things for. They realized that in their attempt to create representation and make sure that they had people with visible disabilities on their stages, on their pitches, they had inadvertently deleted everyone who did not have a visible disability, for example, the neurodivergent community or people with learning disabilities. That's obviously not something they wanted to do. But until they had taken the time to describe who their ideal beneficiary was, what their name was, what their age was, where they came from, what they were interested in, what brands they followed, what things they loved about sport, what things they loved about being disabled. Until they'd actually thought about those things, they hadn't realized that they were excluding a huge segment of their supposed beneficiary group, and had to then make a decision about whether they really were going to be inclusive of all disabilities or whether they were going to target a set number of them, right? And they couldn't have done that without a persona to better understand who they are doing this for. So this is essentially a good way to also force some prioritization between potentially competing beneficiary groups, because not all of the groups that we want to target want the same things. Sometimes they might want completely different things. For example, organizations that are working with both communities that live in coastal areas and with the environment and the animals and the wildlife that might also live in those coastal areas. In some situations, the needs of those two groups may conflict because the community may be more interested in economic opportunities for their children, might be interested in keeping it safe for health reasons, might also be interested in climate change. And the animals do not care about the economic incentives that arise from economic activity at the coastline or in the ocean, right? They care about survival and safety. And even then, they don't really have the agency to make choices for themselves. So what you do and how you handle those two beneficiary groups would be very different. It's worth then having a conversation about, is there a ranking or prioritization between the two, which does not mean that you don't care about a particular group. It simply means that you are best placed, you are best resourced, you have the most capacity and expertise to deal with one beneficiary and support them much better than another group. The third element then is to talk about your theory of change and your mission. I found that theory of change is something which is absolutely fundamental to how nonprofits run, but often something they don't have a full understanding of. Often I see it listed as a number of steps that organizations feel like they need to follow, or something around the ethos or mindset behind what they do. For me, that's not a theory of change. A theory of change is one of two things. Either it is a set of observations you would expect to see to know whether you are on track to deliver your ultimate impact. So if we're trying to achieve X, we will see in the short term A, in the medium term we'll see B, in the long term we'll see C, and that will build up to X. Or it is a flywheel. So if you think of Amazon popularized this concept of a flywheel, where everything that you do creates momentum for the other things. I'll explain more about the flywheel concept in a different video because it's very interesting, but will take some time to explain. But the point is that that's a way of ensuring that every single thing you do is always leading to the impact that you're trying to achieve, and that it also is a reinforcing virtuous circle that keeps going round to maintain and keep momentum of what you're trying to achieve. It then is very clear when you are off track because the flywheel breaks, right? You're not able to continue and keep the circle going. But this also makes it super clear when you have decided to either pursue the wrong mission or the wrong activities, because if you cannot, at the end of this process, link the programs, the projects, the campaigns to what you're trying to achieve, if there is not a sequence or evidence or observations that you could list that you will see on your way to that impact, you have a question to ask about whether that's the wrong impact, whether that's the wrong programs, or whether that's the wrong theory about how those two things connect. There's a problem, and you often have some indication of where to go with it. I think that also during this workshop is a great time to talk about mission, because mission is the reason why you exist, certainly. And often the mission is the ultimate game that you're trying to win when you talk about the theory of change. And so having the conversation in the moment about what specifically your big ambition for the organization is, in whatever time period you think is appropriate, is very helpful in the context of theory of change, because then you're taking what you want to achieve and adding some measurable, observable targets to it to enable some sense of accountability and also clarity in how you get there. The next workshop that I suggest is about goals and strategic pillars. For me, goals are a more time-bound thing than a mission, which might be for the course of your whole organization's life cycle and existence, whereas a goal might be for the next year, for the next 3 years, for the next 5 years. It is what you want to tangibly achieve in there. I do recommend that people use the SMART goal methodology for this, so something that's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. That's just helpful to make sure that you have something that's super clear that everyone can understand. The strategic pillars for me then are the themes that emerge from your goal. So if your goal is about reducing child poverty, for example, the strategic themes will be your strategic pillars. One of them might be supporting families. One of them might be enabling schools. One of them might be lobbying the government. It doesn't really matter what they are. What is important is that you have some clarity on them, because all the programs, campaigns, projects that you have are going to sit under one of those strategic pillars. It's a helpful way to think about things because it doesn't rely on an organizational structure. And it doesn't mean that you have to create artificial silos. In fact, it forces teams that work on related topics to have some framework of thinking about their topics together rather than thinking about them as a department, a division, or a team, which often doesn't give the best possible outcome for your beneficiaries because it's separate and it is doing other things. So when you can have a situation where your goal is clearly broken out into some themes, those themes are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So there's no overlap between them. There's no lack of clarity or duplication. But at the same time, you've covered all the elements that you believe you need to deliver to achieve that goal. And those themes are very clear. It's great then to be able to map the existing activities you're doing to those pillars. Because if you find that you are doing things that, while you think are going to achieve the goal, do not fit under those pillars, either you are missing a pillar or the activity you're talking about doesn't actually fit with the plan. It's just a random side thing you're doing. The next workshop is then about culture and positioning. For many organizations, it actually makes sense to start with culture because culture is such an important portion of who they are and how they work that it dictates everything else. That's certainly the argument that I make in my book, Beyond Buy-in. But for other organizations, especially those who've already tried to work on the strategy by themselves, who haven't gotten the momentum and results they want in the past, they need to start with the actionable stuff, the stuff that they think is the hard stuff first, before they have enough trust in the process and psychological safety to talk about their culture. I often talk about the fact that I don't think culture is about prioritization, collaboration, accountability. I think those things are very much in the realm of ways of working, which I 100% recommend that people work on and clarify before it's time to deliver, preferably in a kickoff session of the teams and the people who are going to deliver. However, I think that culture is much more about a strategic orientation and much more about how your theory of change translates into behaviors, into mindsets, and into the way that people work together on a daily basis. I have another video, which is coming soon, about cultural orientations and talk a little bit about it in my last video. So feel free to check that out or wait for the next one, which is about the 4 different cultures, which I think organizations should be trying to locate themselves amongst, basically. The positioning aspect of this is also really interesting because often organizations talk about there being a disconnect between the culture they have and how they're seen or want to be seen. And that disconnect really does create some challenges for staff, for partners, for beneficiaries, because that disconnect seems often to be disingenuous, inauthentic, or in some way like you're trying to put on a persona or identity that doesn't really exist. So trying to bottom out the difference between the culture you have and the culture you want and the culture that other people see is really helpful for making a decision about where you need to go, and gives you some clarity, I think, on what your unique selling proposition needs to be, that USP, the unique space that you offer and that you take up, gives you some clarity on what that might be. The next workshop then leads directly from that, where you talk about your values, and values in the context of decision making, because values can mean a variety of different things depending on what kind of culture you have. If I say that my culture is a family culture, if I talk about wanting to be representative, wanting to have diversity and inclusion in my organization, that may be around wanting to hear everyone's voices, around wanting to make sure people feel valued. If I'm in more of a commercial culture or a market culture or kind of a winning culture, inclusion and representation for me might be about making sure that people's work speaks for itself, making sure that we have cognitive diversity in the room to come up with the best answers and the best possible solutions for our beneficiaries. Those things are completely different in that context. If I'm in a process culture, then I might see inclusion, diversity, representation as a set of best practice principles I need to put into place, a set of activities with clear milestones that I need to put in place to make sure that I am changing the face of the organization or changing how it treats its people, etc. But there is a very clear best practice framework that I'm applying to that. Could keep on going, but the point is, it is very helpful to talk about your values in the context of your culture, and then to translate that into behaviors and decision-making criteria. Because if your values and your behaviors cannot help people understand how they should make decisions or what kind of decisions they should be making, then they're not particularly helpful, right? They don't become a true guide to how people work together. And it's quite difficult then to test the alignment of your mindsets with your culture, with your mission, with your strategic pillars, with your goals. The next workshop that I have is often around mandate or scope. This is where you're going to work, what you're going to work on, who you're going to work with. It is encapsulating everything that you have worked on when you were thinking about what your mission is, what your theory of change is, what your goals are, what your strategic pillars are, but giving it a much more refined and constrained identity. Because even if you are a nonprofit like the NHS, for example, working in healthcare, the scope of what you do might be predominantly around primary healthcare in certain areas, predominantly around helping people with certain services, etc. in other areas. Geographically, it makes a difference to what you're trying to supply. What you offer to children will be very different to what you offer to those older people in your communities. All of those things around your scope and your mandate, what permissions you give yourself to do, really important. It also, however, I think more importantly, allows you to be able to say what you're not going to do, where you're not going to play, and prevents the kind of scope creep that kind of comes in when people are unclear about the boundaries of their decision making, your strategic pillars, your goals, your mission, and your identity as an organization. So you are basically setting in versus out boundaries and criteria when you have a clear scope definition. That leads you then to thinking about the next workshop, which is trying to think about your programs, your projects, your campaigns. Every organization has a slightly different way of explaining these, but I think of these as essentially what is the work package that you are trying to deliver. These should, as I mentioned before, build up to the strategic pillars. You should be quite clear on the scope of each one of them. And often I ask people to make an inventory of their current activities to try work out if they fit into their strategic pillars, if they are things they want to continue to do because they align with the scope they want to. With other organizations, it's really difficult for them to cut things out. It's much easier for them to have a session ideating on what programs, campaigns, projects they want to have rather than those they currently have, especially if what they're trying to do is have a major step change in how they are delivering as an organization. That's hard to do if you anchor yourself on only what you are doing right now and don't allow yourself to take a zero-based approach of, if we were starting today, what would we do? M&E, monitoring and evaluation, is the next workshop. That's where I recommend that people set either it's the outcomes and key results, it's the key indicators, it's the metrics. It doesn't really matter. As long as what you are measuring yourself against is outcomes, not just outputs. It's not about the 100% utilization of all your teams. It's not about doing as much as you can with the budget you have. It's about getting the right outcomes and making sure that you are achieving your goals and achieving your mission within the parameters you've set. This is also a continuation of this idea of definition of done, because it's essentially going to be the definition of done for all of the activity you do. What will you have to observe to understand that this is working, that this is complete, that this is ready for approval, that this is ready for delivery? You want to specify that upfront so the teams also have an idea of what they are trying to solve for, because what they are measured by or measured against has a fundamental impact on how they behave, on their incentives to change, and on how effective your accountability for your people in your organization is going to be. Last, but certainly not least, is then talking about some stress testing and road mapping. Road mapping often is a much longer process that happens in just one workshop, but we do often try to work on what are the major milestones that someone should expect in the course of your 3-year, 5-year, 10-year strategy. And also thinking about, if we factor in certain possibilities about the future, the economy significantly changing, political landscape changing, your beneficiaries' needs changing. If we factor all of those in, does the strategy still work under stress? Can we ensure that we create the kind of flexibility we need to be responsive when things change so that our strategy can change with them? While at the same time making sure we have something that is practical and actionable so that it doesn't have so much flexibility that people feel like they can just change it whenever they want. It's a fine balance to strike, but it is very helpful for organizations to work with those failure scenarios to try and work out how far their strategy can take them. The goal is not to make a strategy that is failure proof or something that, is going to withstand everything, because you just can't know all the scenarios and all the things that might happen to your organization in the course of a strategic period. The goal, however, is to make sure that you can find vulnerabilities before implementation, watch out for those, and make sure that your monitoring and evaluation gives you enough time and enough lead time to deal with those vulnerabilities when they arise, rather than being on the back foot and only figuring it out a couple of weeks or months after it's already happened. I think that this is something which organizations don't often spend a lot of time on, because they assume that if they've stress tested the budget and if they've done scenario planning of the budget, that is sufficient to account for implementation. And those two things are very different. And I recommend that organizations obviously do both of those things, but especially at the process where you're doing the actual strategy development, before you're getting to planning, before you're getting to the transformation, before you've even gotten into resource allocation, and by resource, people and money and any other infrastructure you have, before you've gotten to any of that, stress test the actual strategy you have. Under what conditions does your mission, your goals, your strategic pillars, your programs, your scope no longer make sense? Under what conditions does your culture crumble, and what impact might that have on the above mentioned things? That's really important. And I think that's also where an independent facilitator can be particularly helpful, because it's hard to see some of those challenges when you're right up against it and you spend all this time invested in your strategy and feel very passionately about it. It is a lot easier for someone who is a little bit more separate and independent from that process to be able to help you evaluate how far you really are from getting to something that's resilient and will likely weather some of the storms you are undoubtedly going to face. So that's all for today. My next workshop is going to be around cultural orientation. So I'm going to share a bit of that agenda and show you some of the slides from that in my next video. See you soon. Thanks.